Hi guys, so most of you will be aware that last year in 2016, August to be precise, I moved to London in England, the UK, from Edinburgh in Scotland, the UK. Long before then, I had been a great lover of London and I had been a regular visitor. I pretty much decided I wanted to move here when I was around 18. It took me a few years, but I eventually got here. And I thought it might be nice to talk about some books set in London for once. So in today's video, I'm going to share with you some of my favourite books and series set in London, as well as a few books set in London that I haven't read yet, but are very high up on my TBR list. So without further ado, let's have a look at the books, shall we? So first up is a book series that I'm sure will come as no surprise to many of you, and that is the Sherlock Holmes series by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I started reading this series when I was quite young, either sort of pre-teen, early teen years, and instantly fell in love with it. And I think the setting of Sherlock Holmes is one of the biggest elements of the stories that ties them all together and makes them feel so real. In fact, if you visit London, there are lots of Sherlock Holmes sites that you can go and see, including the Sherlock Holmes Museum at 221B Baker Street. You all know about Sherlock Holmes, it's classic late 1800s, early 1900s detective stories. There's 4 novels and around 60 short stories if I remember correctly, and they follow the amateur detective Sherlock Holmes, who is incredibly unique amongst detectives, and his companion Dr. Watson, who is a medical doctor that shares apartments with Sherlock Holmes and occasionally helps him solve crimes, whilst keeping a record of those crimes that he publishes in the Strand magazine, which is also the magazine that Sherlock Holmes was actually published in. Lots of inception going on there. If you want to know more about Sherlock Holmes, I actually have a whole video on the topic. But like I said, I think the setting is very visceral and comes throughout the stories. Obviously, it's a London of the past, a Victorian London as opposed to a modern London, but it's lovely to see the history of London that comes through in the stories. You come across a lot of different locations throughout the city, and yeah, one of my absolute favourite series, as you all probably know. The next book is a slightly less cheerful depiction of the city, as it is a apocalyptic novel, and that is The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. This one was originally published in 1951, and like I said, is a science fiction apocalyptic story in which our protagonist wakes up to discover that he is one of the only people seemingly left on the planet, and certainly the UK and London in which he finds himself in, who still has his eyesight. Everybody else around him has gone blind, and the whole country starts to fall apart. We do move outside of London in later parts of the story, but we begin in the centre of London in a hospital with our protagonist, who then goes out into the city to try and find out what is going on. I always really enjoyed the way this book was written as well, because it kind of has that stereotypical English sensibility of it, you know, kind of twee and reserved and quite sensible as opposed to hyper emotional, I guess is kind of how it reads, despite it being on an incredibly intense topic. An absolutely enthralling story and one of my favourite John Wyndham books. Next up is the book on the list that I've read most recently out of all of these books, and it's a book which I read whilst I was living in London, and the location came through so much for me, and just the names of the streets that were mentioned and the locations that the characters visited, I really felt like I was there, and it was so nice being so familiar with the city at this point that I recognised so many of those, and that is Sophia Khan is Not Obliged by Aisha Malik. This is the first in a series. I think it's only got 2 parts at the moment, and I haven't had a chance to read the sequel yet. But it follows Sophia Khan, a young Muslim woman living in London and working in a publishing house, as she kind of tries to navigate the dating scene and ends up being enlisted by her publishing house to write an entire book on the subject. It feels very real, it has a lot going on under the surface, and it's incredibly relatable whether you are Muslim or not, and obviously it's great to be exposed to different cultures from your own. London is definitely a big part of this story, and I obviously work in publishing in London now as well, so that was really enjoyable for me. I felt really connected to the character. And another book of quite a different genre that's set in London is The Portable Door by Tom Holt. This is the first in a comic fantasy series, and it follows our main character, who has just got a job at a large corporate company in London, which he doesn't quite know what it involves, and everybody around him in this company seems a little bit odd. and strange, and the tasks he's being asked to do seem to have absolutely no meaning. And like I mentioned, this is a comic fantasy novel, so as things escalate we discover that there are some fantastical elements to this company, and it all is a little bit mad and silly but fun and laugh out loud, and I love that. And like I mentioned, set in London, the whole series is set in London. I just really like the setting of London, just like I like living here, because it's such a bustling city. There's so much going on, it's huge, there's so many different people, and I think that's an amazing setting that can really be taken advantage of by authors who are willing to give it a try. Within the first 2 weeks of moving here, I read a book set in London. That was Benefits by Zoe Fairbairns, and one of the reasons I was so pleased to read this book when I first moved here is because it's a book that came out in the 1970s, which is when my mum lived in London, and she also read it around that time living there. And the book itself was inspired by political and feminist discussions that were going on at the time. It's a dystopian book, like I said, inspired by those issues in the 70s, that explores perhaps how they could have unravelled into the 80s, 90s and early 2000s. It's a dystopian novel that explores the oppression of women, but equally how that then oppresses everybody in society, restrictions on reproductive rights, and women being forced out of the workplace after obviously it being a big deal that women were kind of in the workplace in the 1970s, and kind of how that was pushed back against. It's a really interesting novel, really interesting when considered in the time it was written as well. And like I said, it was a nice experience reading that story, recommended to me by my mum, knowing that she read it at a similar time in her life, in her 20s, when she lived in London in the 70s. I would also like to mention Bodies of Water by V.H. Leslie, which is again set partially in Victorian London. This one is split between a setting in Victorian London and modern London, which is such an interesting way to explore London, although most of the story are set indoors in specific buildings, so you don't get to see a lot of London in the story. But one place that does play a large role in the story is the Thames, as the building that both our characters essentially live in is situated along the Thames. Now this building I'm talking about is a building which is converted into flats, which our modern day character lives in, that was originally a treatment facility for like women's hysteria in the Victorian era, which our other character lives in. And I love stories that explore the history of the treatment of women's hysteria, as it's an incredibly scary thing that happened. And I think it's fascinating, and I think this book definitely explores those themes of lack of control over one's body and women's relationships with men, as well as women's relationship with other women. And I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was a really interesting concept, those two parallel stories running alongside one another. On that topic, another book that does explore hysteria and is partially set in London is Elijah's Mermaid, another Victorian novel. But I will link a video where I talked about both of those books in more detail for you to listen to if you're interested in those. So like I mentioned, there are a few books on my TBR list that are set in London, so I thought I'd mention those to you, and you could maybe tell me your thoughts if you've read them. The first one is Brick Lane by Monica Ali. This book was in fact shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize and has received so much praise. It is about an 18-year-old Bangladeshi girl who moves to London, Brick Lane being in London if you're familiar, and she moves here in order to marry an older man. Equally, we also follow her sister, and it's of course an immigrant story to London, which is something that I haven't read in my other books, so I'm really excited to read about somebody else's story living in London. And like I said, I've heard amazing things about this book. Next up on my TBR list is Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. Now I have a few Neil Gaimans on my TBR list. I definitely like to read more of his stuff, particularly his adult fantasy, and Neverwhere is one I have heard rave reviews about. It seems to be a lot of people's favourite, and from what I'm aware, this one explores a underworld in London of like magical fantasy creatures. I'd also like to read Night Watch by Sarah Waters. I'd love to read anything by Sarah Waters, I haven't gotten around to it yet. This one is set in 1940s post-war London. That's everything I have to mention in this video though. I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of the books I'd mentioned, and in particular I would love your recommendations for more books set in London. And let me know if you're a fan of books set in London, or if you have one place that you love reading books set in as well. Until next time though, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys.